announced that the Mac is taking another huge leap forward by transitioning to Apple Silicon. And we promised that the first Mac with Apple Silicon would arrive by the end of this year. To tell you more, here's John.
Today, we are introducing M1, which is able to achieve miraculous performance per watt and breakthrough levels of energy efficiency. With M1 Pro and M1 Max, we were able to exceed the graphics performance of integrated GPUs and able to far outperform our competition in terms of performance per watt. Now, with our Deep Fusion technology, we can stitch together two M1 Max chips to form an incredibly powerful M1 Ultra that brings unparalleled performance to the ARM architecture. For the Mac Pro, it's... Why do you freaking need more performance than that? M1 Ultra is plenty. That's way too much power. Mac Pro is just ridiculous. You don't need a Mac Pro. That's fine. Just get over it. Be happy with what you have. I'm taking a holiday. Good day. For the first time in a while, we actually have, somewhat negative news surrounding the Apple Silicon Mac Pro. But I think it's justified. I don't think that many people were going to be in the market for this Mac anyway. But essentially, this report comes from Bloomberg, which isn't right about everything. Let me preface that. However, they have been very, very, spooky accurate with the rollout of the Apple Silicon chips that Apple has put in their Macs. They were spot on with the same number of CPU cores, high-efficiency cores, and GPU cores, starting with the M1. They were right about the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. They were even right about the M1 Ultra, so even though they don't get everything right, and I don't believe everything they say, I do think that their reporting surrounding the Apple Silicon rollout is fairly reputable, and their latest report claims that they are no longer planning this crazy chip that we've been talking about basically for years. Honestly, there was a lot of talk about the Apple Silicon Mac Pro, even as the cheese grater Mac Pro was launching in 2019, because everyone was like, well, yeah, this is going to be really powerful, but Apple Silicon's around the corner, and that's going to be even better. So there's just been years and years of hype leading up to this, and there was a lot of talk about them having a 48-core CPU and 128-core GPU, because it was essentially going to be four M1 Max dies all stitched together, whereas the Ultra was just two. We didn't know what they were going to call that. Bloomberg was saying it was going to be a M2 Extreme chip. The naming already sounds a little stupid, but their logic in the article is that Apple has realized that in order to stitch this much silicon together and to make the Mac Pro bigger and prioritize hopefully a certain amount of modularity, so alongside your unified RAM and your integrated GPU, you would still be able to add PCIe slots for more storage and more RAM, and all of that was going to make a $10,000 plus Mac. And now with the existence of the Mac Studio, which you can get with an M1 Ultra chip for sub $5,000, Apple's logic with it is this is probably going to be so niche, so few people are going to buy the Mac Pro that it's just going to be too expensive to get a supply chain in place. Probably partly because they're working so hard right now on moving all of their manufacturing out of China, and they're trying to have more domestic production of Apple Silicon chips. So to complicate the Apple Silicon chip supply chain even further and be introducing this new chip that's four M1 Maxes stitched together, all of that money, all of that time and investment is going into the Mac Pro, and how many people are actually going to buy it? Okay, we know there's Marquez. Yes, MKBHD will definitely buy one. Sure, maybe you got iJustine and your average consumer. Okay, so YouTubers will probably buy the Mac Pro because they'll make their money back on it making a video on it, but for the rest of the industry, there's major film studios and major game studios, but they're going to be using custom hardware anyway, and there's also the argument to be made that Mark Gurman didn't talk about in his article, but we've seen scaling issues with Apple Silicon. Max Tech brought this up in some of his videos testing out the M1 Ultra, and I'm not as in-depth as him, but I definitely discovered after testing the M1 Ultra that when you're stitching two M1 Maxes together, at least with my workflow of video editing, it doesn't necessarily result in that much faster of an export test. So I'm somewhat of the belief that once you start stitching all of these cores together, ARM doesn't make as big an impact as it does for the smaller portable market. I'm not saying that Apple should have stuck with x86 or that they were wrong to switch to their own silicon, because Apple rightly knew that most Mac sales are MacBooks. Most people are not buying things like the Mac Pro or the Mac Studio. That's a lot more niche, and in regards to laptops, the ARM architecture in Apple Silicon is just substantially better than the competition, and way, way better than what Apple was using before, and I don't really think there's any chip manufacturer out there that could outperform what Apple is getting with their own custom designs, and that has likely resulted resulted in a huge boost in sales for both the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro, and it will continue to perform very, very well for them. But once you start getting ARM up to these extreme levels of performance and you start comparing it to things like the $50,000 Mac Pro and say, well, that one had 1.5 terabytes of RAM, that one had an insane amount of GPU performance, how do we build that on the ARM architecture? Well, it gets a tad more complicated. And I also think there's some truth, because we haven't seen Apple talk much, rightfully, about the sales of this high-end cheese grater Mac Pro since it originally launched 3 years ago. But I have the prediction, especially since Apple has unveiled and shipped so much great, powerful Apple Silicon Macs now, that not that many people were buying the cheese grater Mac Pro. It was so extremely expensive compared to the trash can Mac Pro that it was replacing, that I feel like the new Mac Pro was almost catered towards a completely different demographic. And that's why I said in my videos previously, I don't even think it should have been called the Mac Pro. I would have called it the Mac Enterprise. If Apple wants to make $40,000 Macs that are used by an incredibly small percentage of the population, I guess they can. But if the sales for them continue to dip, and of course we've had this big performance boost with the switch to ARM, that means that people like the Marquezes of the world are comfortable switching to the Mac Studio, which maxed out is $8,000, which means the number of people outside of the YouTube community that are willing to buy a $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 Mac dwindles a lot, because you can hardly justify that when the performance of the Mac Studio is so good. So it's not like I'm trying to say that the M2 Extreme chip or something was just not going to be that much faster. I just think that the return on investment of Apple making that Mac was not going to be very high, because very few people could justify needing a computer with that much extreme speed. But that doesn't mean that the Mac Pro is not coming. That's not what this report is. Mark Gurman is saying in his report that they are just going to settle basically with an Ultra chip. And of course, the Mac Pro is coming later, so this would be an M2 Ultra. But then, of course, that has everyone wondering, well, what's the difference going to be between the Mac Studio and the Mac Pro, right? They're both expensive Apple desktop towers, and they both can fit Ultra-level chips in them. Some people are speculating that means that the Mac Studio was like a stopgap, kind of like the iMac Pro. They release it once, and then they never upgrade it again. Whereas I tend to think that there will be a M2 Ultra Mac Pro, and it will probably prioritize having a bit more modularity. Maybe through some Apple magic, they'll let you use discrete GPUs alongside your integrated GPUs and add in a lot more RAM as needed. But this could mean that it ends up looking kind of a lot more like the 2019 Mac Pro. It just happens to have an M2 Ultra chip inside of it instead of an Intel chip. And that will allow them to make a very thermally friendly chassis that lets you clock that CPU and GPU really, really high. And that gives you the modularity that the Mac Studio doesn't give you, but in terms of, does it get like a dedicated chip that the Mac Studio can't get? I'm guessing no, at least based on this report. It will still be a very fast chip. There's no doubt about that, and it will be the fastest Mac you can buy, but not shipping it with the crazy 48-core CPU or 120-core GPU, and instead just settling for, a 20-core CPU and just a few hundred gigs of RAM rather than terabytes of RAM might allow them to make a Mac Pro that is more catered towards the $10,000 budget range rather than the $20,000 to $30,000 budget range. While I still hope that the Mac Studio gets updates and they continue to refresh that somewhat regularly, I wouldn't be surprised if they first ship the M2 Ultra in the Mac Pro and then for a while don't update the Mac Studio, because it's going to make a lot more sense in Apple's product lineup to give the Mac Pro some exclusive hardware that you can't get elsewhere. So maybe when the M2 Ultra chip is ready, that's when they ship the Mac Pro, but then the Mac Studio is just kind of left on the website, kind of like how the M1 Mac Mini is now, waiting preciously for its refresh. It's like, hey, I could take some better chips, I could have some, please. And while we don't know this for sure, I feel pretty confident that most people buying the Mac Studio are getting the M1 Max version, which is in the $2,000 to $3,000 price range, and that keeps it kind of comfortably cheaper than what the Mac Pro is likely going to start at. If it's like a binned Ultra chip for the entry-level model, I could see that starting closer to $5,000, and then with upgrades and all of your modules and graphics cards or RAM or SSDs that you want to add to that, it can become a $10,000 computer when fully spec'd out. But I don't think this is the worst thing in the world. It means that for people that kind of watch car videos so that they can see how fast the Rimac Nevera is, it's fun to see other people experience that, but how many people are watching the Rimac Nevera videos because they are actually planning to buy one? It's like, yeah, no, we're not actually going to buy it. And I feel like that's how the Apple community was surrounding the Mac Pro launch. It's going to be insanely fast. It's going to have so many cores. It's going to be absurdly quick. How many of us are going to buy it? it? Oh, yeah, we're not interested in buying it. We just kind of want Apple to open up their R&D and show off how fast they can get. But when there's supply chain issues going on, and Apple is probably seeing flatlining sales for the Intel Mac Pro right now, and now that performance is covering so many use cases with the Mac Studio already, they're like, why do we need to spend so much time and money on this crazy fast chip that YouTubers are gonna buy, and that's about it? If they can tell that it's not gonna be that profitable for them, then they're smart enough to not release it. And my theory is that the 2019 Mac Pro never really sold in any significant volume. I know there's some of you out there saying, you know, I know some companies that would buy that, and I know there's some people that want it, but if Apple did really see demand for it, then they wouldn't be scaling back on production for it and pushing it off. But it is definitely a bit sad that Tim Cook, who was a very reliable leaker, said that Apple would be able to switch away from Intel within 2 years, and now we're going into 2023 with 2 Intel Macs still being sold on Apple's website. Whether or not those Macs are still in production and they're just selling out of existing inventory, we don't know for sure. My guess is they're not building any Intel Macs right now, but for the most part, I do think that the Apple Silicon Mac lineup is very, very strong. There's lots of great options and room for improvement. We all want our M2 Mac Minis. We all want the iMac Pro to get refreshed. But for the most part, there's decent options for people to choose from, and the fact that we're not going to get that M2 God tier that you were going to watch 20 videos testing the Geekbench scores for, yeah, it's a bit of a bummer, but it's not the end of the world, and I think it makes a lot of sense for the company. What do you guys think of Apple not going so absurdly crazy with the Mac Pro? Would you be interested in spending extra on a Mac if it meant that you could replace individual parts, even if that meant that it cost a lot more than the Mac Studio does? I don't think so personally, but feel free to disagree with me down in the comments below. Thank you to everyone supporting this channel directly with Tailosive Tech Pro. It seriously helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I'll see you all in the next one.